Welcome to Highley. I'm Sally Bunn and I have lived and worked in Highley for over 25 years. As the local librarian and a member of the History Society, I have accumulated a lot of information about Highley. Through this video, I hope to share this interest and knowledge with the local community and potential visitors. The village is situated just off the A442, 7 miles south of Bridgnorth. It lies on a ridge dividing the contrasting valleys of the River Severn and the Ball Brook. Highley is possibly the largest community in central England to still retain its village status, having a population of just over 4,000 people. The name Highley is Anglo-Saxon in origin and probably means the clearing of Huga. It appears in the Domesday Book and the owner is recorded as Lady Godiva. Later in the Middle Ages, it was home to the Langland family, from whom William Langland, author of The Vision of Piers Plowman, was descended. The arrival of the Highley Mining Company in the latter part of the 19th century completely transformed the character of the village. Much of what we see today dates back to this period, but as you will see in this video, Highley still holds on to some of its earlier origins. We will begin our tour of Highley at Garden Village, known locally as Top End. Woodhill Farm was built about 1810, although it was only recorded under this name from 1821. It was farmed until 1888 by John Wellings from Middleton Scriven, but then became the home of Cornelius Dupre, whose father became the Vicar of Highley. Fir Tree Cottages were originally built as a Wesleyan Methodist chapel and were constructed at the same time as Woodhill Farm. Most of the men who worked at Highley Colliery were primitive Methodists, and they built their own chapel in the heart of the village, so the Wesleyan chapel was eventually converted into houses. Newcastle Buildings was built at the turn of the century as the working men's club. It served this purpose for about a decade before being relocated to the High Street in the village. Most of Garden Village dates from just before the First World War, when it was developed by the Billingsley Colliery Company to house their workers from the adjacent parish. The mine failed and the houses were used by the rival Highley Mining Company. The Malt Shovel Public House is the oldest building in this area, built in 1690 as a farm. Looking across the fields at the rear of the Malt Shovel, we can see a grassy hump, which is all that remains of one of the medieval farms which existed here. A beautiful timber-framed house, it was first documented in 1587. But by Victorian times it had been converted into a pair of farm labourers' cottages. It was finally demolished in the 1930s. The Castle Public House is relatively modern, being built in the middle of the 19th century. Garden Village Green. This area, with its crescent of shops, originally contained an orchard. The trees were cut down in the last century to provide a safe and visible play area for local children. It is still known today as the Orchard. Wandering down the main road towards the village, we pass Clee View, a row of miners' cottages, now listed as a perfect example of its kind. Hollywood Park and Ashley Gardens are modern estates which now fill the gap that used to exist between the two ends of the village. The recreation ground. The miners of the village formed several sporting and social clubs, and from these emerged 3 professional footballers. One of these was Jerry Hitchens, an England international footballer who subsequently pursued his career in Italy. The recreation ground is currently undergoing major changes, which will result in a new leisure centre and multi-use facility for the people of Highley. Many of the existing facilities in the village will be relocated under one roof, creating a totally new social centre for the area. Largely funded by national lottery grants, it will be a 21st century enhancement of the miners' 19th century efforts. The old vicarage dates from the early 17th century and replaced the much smaller house next to St Mary's Church. Here is to be found one of England's oldest and tallest tulip trees, standing about 40 feet high. There are also 6 ancient hornbeams which are trimmed in the shape of the 7-branched candlestick of Jerusalem. These are known locally and oddly as the 7 Sisters. Hall Farm is just one of several farms in the area which has its origins in medieval times. The house as we see it today, however, is much later than this. Returning to the main street, we come upon the Bache Arms public house, which was originally called the New Inn and was first recorded as such in 1839. Silverdale Terrace was the first row of terraced houses to be built in Highley. It was named for the miners from Silverdale Colliery in Staffordshire who came to train the local workforce. It used to be known as Long Row. The clock sculpture was commissioned by Highley Initiative in the late 1990s as a lasting memorial to the mine and its men. It was originally to be just a sculpture, but lent itself to becoming the base for the village clock. The artist David Howarth is noted for other metal constructions which exist all over Shropshire and beyond. He has captured the image of the miner and the pit wheel for all time, here beside the village car park. Most of the buildings in the High Street date from the turn of the last century and were laid out in response to the expansion of the mines. Date stones on the buildings are all from the early 1900s, as prior to this no buildings existed here. The 3 terraced streets running off the High Street were also erected in the very early 1900s. The library. Few villages of this size can boast a permanent library. Indeed, most have to rely upon a travelling library visiting on a fortnightly basis. Up until the 1970s, this was the arrangement for Highley, until a site on the welfare ground was utilised as a permanent base for a converted static caravan library, with a smaller caravan adjacent to it for staff use. Here the library stood until 1989, when the former police station on the corner of Bark Street was purchased by Shropshire County Council and suitably converted, the library relocated, and this has been its home ever since. On the corner of Church Lane is the old school, built in 1863 on the site of the original smithy. This was refurbished in the 1990s and is now the Parish Hall for the church. St Mary's Church. The exact date of St Mary's Church is not known, but much of it is early Norman. This is rare for a South Shropshire church, where late Norman is the rule. The nave is one of the oldest parts of the church within its Norman walls. It also has a fine 15th century carved oak ceiling, which was restored in 1880. The chancel has a Norman window in the north wall and a Norman door in the south wall. Much of the Norman masonry has been restored over the years. The last major restoration was undertaken in the late 19th century by William Jordan, church warden for over 60 years. This brass tablet was commissioned to honour his memory. The West Tower was added during the Perpendicular period. It holds the organ loft, which was built by public subscription in 1807. It probably had a gallery when it was built, but this was pulled down together with the access stairs in 1880. The tower houses 6 bells, which were rehung in the early 1900s. The south door still hangs on its original hinges and opens with the original iron ring, dating from the 12th or 13th century. In the churchyard is this medieval cross with finely carved heads, showing headdress fashionable in the time of Henry VII. Tradition has it that the cross served as a platform for travelling preachers. If they didn't enter the church, they would not have needed the permission of the resident minister. Church House was originally the home of the village priest and dates from the period 1480 to 1520. It ceased to be the vicarage in the early 17th century, about the time of King James I. It is the only example in the area of close studding, the use of parallel vertical timbers, which was a very extravagant way of building in the 15th century. Church cottages. Part of the construction of these cottages is of square-framed timber, which dates them from between 1630 and 1730. They stand in a prime position next to the church and opposite the site of the village well. Rose Cottage. This was the village smithy throughout the 19th century and still retains part of the original rough-hewn building stones. Oak Cottage. This little square frame timber house is most certainly the oldest building in Highley to be used solely as a home, and was constructed in the 17th century. All the surviving older buildings were built as farmhouses. Smoke Alley. This row of white sandstone cottages was built around 1800, probably to house quarry workers or colliers at an early mine in the area. Manor House and Manor Farm cottages. These were all part of the same farm, the dwellings being built between 1587 and 1601. The status of the manor declined during the last quarter of the 17th century, when the lord of the manor built himself a new home on another site. Manor Farm cottages were probably the original site of the first manor house, but all that remains now is the stone wall fronting the buildings. Severn Valley Country Park. This marks the site of Highley Colliery 1878 to 1969 and is dedicated to over 1,000 men who worked here. The whole of this area, together with the rest of the country park on either side of the river, was reclaimed in the 1980s from the spoils of the mine. For most of its life, Highley was a typical farming village, but being set in the middle of the Wyre Forest coalfield, mining was ultimately to dominate its history. The famous engineer, Thomas Telford, nearly became bankrupt trying to establish a mine here in the early part of the 19th century. But in the latter part of the century, the Highley Mining Company did establish a successful mine, bringing work and prosperity to the village. Just before the outbreak of World War II, mining was extended to the other side of the river at Alverley. Most of the workforce, however, continued to live in Highley. At its peak in 1957, the mine employed over 1,000 men, many of whom still live here. The miners' halt and screens. This section of the country park was developed from 1935 onwards as the coal preparation plant, or screens, for Alverley Colliery. Coal was brought to the site from the mine by way of a rope-operated tramway which crossed the river via a specially constructed concrete bridge. A return wheel set in the ground on the Highley side of the bridge is part of this tramway system. In the 1960s, the tramway was replaced by an aerial ropeway, the foundations for the piers still being visible on either side of the bridge. A halt was opened on the railway for miners arriving by train, and in the late 1940s the National Coal Board built the present road which connects with the village centre. Highley Station. This is one of the stations on the Severn Valley Railway and was opened in 1862. The station increased in importance in 1880 with the opening of Highley Colliery, and a line ran over the road to connect with the colliery sidings. The railway runs between Kidderminster and Bridge North and is one of the West Midlands' biggest tourist attractions. The Ship Inn was Highley's first public house, opening in 1770 and catering for bargees, colliers and quarrymen. Fresh bread was baked here in large ovens and delivered around the area by horse and cart. Fishermen's cottages and holiday chalets now make up most of the dwellings along the riverside in this area. Industry has gone hand in hand with Highley for many hundreds of years, in particular the quarrying of stone from beside the river. The stone was then sent down the river to Worcester and beyond. In fact, the walls of Worcester Cathedral are said to contain Highley stone. Before the construction of the Severn Valley Railway, the river was the main means of long-distance communication in the area. Along the towpath are the sites of several houses, some ruined, some still lived in, which indicates the importance of this part of the village. Some of these dwellings are associated with coal mining and quarrying, which flourished here around 1800. The bridge at Brooksmouth was a very important part of this towpath. The two houses here were built in 1796 as part of a wharf. From this point, a tramway ran along the Ball Brook to a colliery and ironworks at Billingsley. The bridge is made of cast iron and was built by the Coalbrookdale Company. This is a visible reminder of a time when the river was a busy highway, full of barges and bustling with noise and activity. Situated at the end of the village, just beyond Netherton Lane, is the range of buildings known as the Pen Factory. This business was founded after the Second World War by Mr. A.S. Charles, who had already run his father's steel pen company. In 1949, he merged the business with D. Lennart & Co., a firm which has traded worldwide in precision metal pressings since 1856. Today, the Pen Factory continues the tradition of producing high-quality nibs for all the leading pen makers around the world, and is now Highley's major employer. Netherton. From Anglo-Saxon times, a separate community existed here at Netherton. In the late 17th century, the site of the manor house was transferred to Netherton House, and this became the seat of the self-styled village squires until the death of the last one, John Oakley Bedard, in 1944. The house is in two parts now: a white sandstone extension of indeterminate date and a brick portion from around 1670 built as the new manor house. The site of Ball Mill was given to the convent of the White Ladies of Brood in the 13th century, and it was probably they who built the mill. A timber frame section was built around 1600 by Thomas Lowe, one of the most influential landowners in the village at that time. Stone and brick extensions were then added from the late 18th century onwards. Corn grinding ceased after the First World War. The building has been sympathetically restored since the 1990s. The Donkey Bridge. According to tradition, this twin-arched bridge was built over the Ball Brook in 1708 by the Squire of Kinlet, Sir William Child. He supposedly built it to prevent guests from getting their feet wet when they visited him at Kinlet Hall. It is marked on a map of 1756, when it was then referred to as the New Bridge. Its current name suggests that it was, by tradition, a packhorse bridge. The northeast of the village was common land called Highley Wood in medieval and Tudor times, where any villager could graze animals. The Hag Farm dates from 1825, but the name is medieval, suggesting some kind of woodland enclosure. The land from here up to the top of the bank was divided up amongst the villagers in about 1615 and enclosed into fields. This brings us to the conclusion of our walk and talk around Highley. I hope you've enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed making it. If you would like to find out more about Highley, then why not visit? Or log on to the internet and visit the Highley website.